Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, April 5th, 2021, and I've recently been researching a part of the Constitution that I've never really studied in detail. I mean, just kind of like some cursory reading over time, but I've kind of dug into this in the last few months, and that is the Three-Fourths Clause or Three-Fifths Clause or the Three-Fifths Compromise. See, I'm just learning as I go. So on this episode, I want to share with you an overview of what I've learned so far. I'm going to take some bits and pieces of various pieces of research and some summaries of things that I've learned and basically paint a picture of what I've learned so far. That is primarily the history behind it. Like, where did they get that number? Why is there a 3/5? And what was the reason for even having it as a debate? And for that, we actually have to go back to taxation issues during the Revolution and up through the Articles of Confederation and the years to follow, over a period of about 14 years that we have to go back through that history to understand. I think it's very interesting history, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed learning about it so far. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. There you're going to get all the different episodes we've done over the years. On individual episodes like this one today, I generally publish an individual new post for each episode about anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours after the live broadcast is done, and you'll find all the stuff that I've referenced, links in those show notes to other articles, some research papers, sometimes previous episodes, so you can read, watch, listen, and learn more on your own time, because I am just scratching the surface. And unlike on this one, I am definitely really just in the learning phase. I would not consider myself an expert on this, but I think I've got a good grasp on the history. Like, for example, I did an episode on Thomas Paine earlier in the year, and I made a mistake on some of his early writings, and so I corrected it in a later episode. I think that's a really good process. I like being able to share that stuff with you, and sometimes I learn stuff from you in the live chat. Anyways, the show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. That's where you find everything for the show, including our membership program, where you can support us for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. And speaking of our membership program, I want to send a bit of gratitude, actually a ton of gratitude, to just a handful of the many people who have signed up with us as members to support us, to put their financial faith behind our work recently. There's Dan in Oregon, my buddy, with the Culinary Libertarian podcast. Thank you so much. Jason in North Dakota, and Chase in North Carolina, who I should have mentioned quite a while ago. Alexis in Montana, Diane in Indiana, Amanda in Colorado. So I think Amanda, during the live stream last week, and I missed it in the live chat, she had signed up right during the show. So thank you, Amanda, Kathy in Virginia, and everyone else. I'm so grateful for your support. And I want to say a quick hello to everyone in the live chat as well, while we allow people a moment to get notifications to join us in the live stream. Patricia, Funky Euphemism, Tim Martin, MRGF, Clay Kent, Tyler B., Senator DT in Elkhart, Indiana. Good to see you. Justin Bayola, same. Justin Morrison, Larry Clark, Melody, Irwin. There's Dan Reed. Good to see you, buddy. Richard Banks, Darlene, Blue North Wind, Jay Armstrong, and everyone else. Jay Armstrong is already on the path on this one. Taxes and supposed representation. Taxes is a big part of this, and there's some interesting history going back to the Articles of Confederation. So let's get right to this. Again, show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I hope you had a great weekend, and I'm very grateful for you kicking off your week with me here today on some geeky but important constitutional history. Let's start out with this Three-Fifths Compromise. Man, I struggle with that. Here from Wiki, this is just a nice general kind of mainstream overview. And they say the Three-Fifths Compromise was a compromise, and there were a lot of compromises at the Philadelphia Convention. Supremacy Clause, for example, was a big one. All kinds of stuff where there were different views on how to deal with them. But I think this was probably, at least today, when you look back on history, where people talk about it, very few people actually know the history behind it. And it's, of course, very, very controversial. And if you're not familiar with it, here, this is it. The Three-Fifths Compromise was a compromise reached among state delegates during the 1787 Constitutional Convention. I call it the Philadelphia Convention, due to disputes over how slaves would be counted when determining a state's total population. This number would determine the state's number of seats in the House of Representatives and how much it would pay in taxes. Jay, you were on that for sure. The compromise counted 3/5 of each state's slave population toward that state's total population for the purpose of apportioning the House of Representatives. Now, some people just kind of knee-jerk, and I can understand where it comes from. They look back and they're like, oh, yeah, they didn't even consider, well, when you have slavery, you're not really considering a human being, a full human being in the first place. But this really wasn't just about the issue of slavery. It was really about taxation and representation. So let's look at, I want to also point out that Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, which was ratified some decades later, it didn't necessarily directly or formally repeal this. This is Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, this 3/5 compromise. It didn't really officially repeal that clause, this 3/5 compromise, but it basically neutered it in practice. Here from laws.com, constitution.laws.com, just interesting overview stuff. They put it this way. The 3/5 compromise was proposed by James Wilson and Roger Sherman. That's really kind of blending two different things together. Roger Sherman was involved in discussing proposals for representation in the House of Representatives, but James Wilson is the guy, and this is a Northern Federalist. He was not the guy in the South, and we'll talk about why that happened in a bit. He wasn't from one of the slave states. This is Pennsylvania. He was on the Supreme Court, appointed by George Washington. I've covered his famous State House Yard speech of October 6th. He was very influential in getting the Constitution ratified during the debates over ratification. He actually proposed the 3/5 compromise in a deal that I'll get to in a few minutes. He said they were both, back to laws.com, it was proposed by James Wilson and Roger Sherman. However, it has its roots back further in history, dating back to the Continental Congress in 1783, and actually probably even before that as well. The compromise was a result of the apportionment of taxes being related to land values. I didn't know this when I first started digging into it. And here from Tax Foundation, they've got a nice, interesting article on this that, of course, I will link to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. They talk about how failed tax policies, and of course, this is going to be right up their alley. Maybe it's kind of their talking point as well, but failed tax policies is what actually drove this. I would actually say, like, if there wasn't slavery in the first place, this wouldn't have been a conversation. Of course, this was an immoral, horrible, evil institution, whether it was practiced. I'm not trying to impose my own moral view on other people, but in my view, it doesn't matter what the situation is in the world. This was an evil institution. It always has been an evil institution and always will be an evil institution. But it was something that they were grappling. The whole world was grappling with this kind of thing. How do you deal with it? How do you move forward? Anyways, so let's talk about taxes during the Articles of Confederation and even while the Revolution was still raging in the late 1770s. The Articles, they say, failed to grant the new national government any general taxing power. Hardly surprising given the role of taxes in the still raging Revolutionary War, or War for Independence, War of Secession. Instead, they established that the charges of war and other expenses incurred for the common defense or general welfare would be defrayed out of a common treasury supplied by the states. This was in Article 8 of the Articles of Confederation. Going further, this is interesting about the debates over ratification of the Articles of Confederation, which is at some point I really should get into a little bit more here as well, because the more we understand what they went through in the years before 1787, the more a lot of their arguments make sense in 1787 and 1788 as well. Going further at Tax Foundation, they say, lacking any authority to levy taxes on its own, the new national government was in the unenviable position of requisitioning the states and hoping for the best. Basically, they would say, look, this is what we need. You figure out how to do this. Now, during the drafting of the Articles of Confederation, 3 methods of assessing states' contribution quotas were considered. One, they did it based totally on population. We're just going to count the number of people, and then that is going to be the amount that you're going to contribute in a ratio. 2, according to land value, because the idea was then how much could you contribute? How much did you have the ability to contribute? And then 3, according to the value of all property. A motion, they write, to apportion state obligations on the basis of all property except household goods and apparel failed, by a 5-4 vote. An alternative, obligations apportioned by the estimated value of lands and improvements, was adopted. So under the Articles of Confederation, here it is, Article 8, they're talking about how to pay off the war. How do they pay off these massive expenses, which really led to a lot of other problems in coming years, Shays' Rebellion and things like that as well. Here it is, all charges of war and all other expenses that shall be incurred for the common defense or general welfare and allowed by the United States in Congress assembled shall be defrayed out of a common treasury, which shall be supplied by the several states in proportion to the value of all land within each state. Now, I'm not in favor of centralized power. I'm not even in favor of taxation, but I recognize that in a time of war, that costs a lot of money, and you're not always just going to find a Morris, for example, to fund things. You're not going to find a treasurer that just throws all their loot at things. And you really do need cash to be able to fight these types of things. So they had a lot of debt that needed to be dealt with. And debt was a problem, a big part of the debate over ratification as well, how to deal with that. And in the years to follow, Hamilton versus Madison, for example. So this is how they decided to do it. The Congress would requisition the states, and then they would base the percentage off of the land value in each state. But get this, going back to laws.com, many states began to depreciate the value of the land in order to provide relief from their taxes. I mean, this is like currency manipulation. When you have the ability to change the value of something in order to save some money, you might want to take that up. And this just kind of happened. I haven't actually went through the details of this, but in a number of sources, I found this over and over and over. The lightest version I put of this was many states were accused, or that I found on this, many states were accused of this. So this was definitely an issue at the time that one state starts doing it. You would think that, of course, another would do it as well as soon as they caught wind. Well, now we're paying based on, we were being honest. I mean, who knows if government people were ever really honest, but we're paying based off of this amount, and now they're saying, well, their land is only worth 70%, and so they have to pitch in less. So they put together a committee under the Articles of Confederation. The Continental Congress put together a committee that would supposedly rectify the situation by implementing the apportionment of taxes in relation to the state's population. However, this idea was met with the dispute over how to consider slaves. So it's really started at that point. Well, do we include them? They're contributing to the economy in a weird, immoral, horrible way, but this is part of the economic impact. So they started having debates about this. So the dispute was over how to consider slaves in the apportionment process and the actual ratio of slaves to free people at that time. So here from an article by Rob Natelson, which was originally published, I think, at Epic Times. Let me see. Just scrolling through here. Yeah, Epic Times, just in the last few weeks, and then over at his site at i2i.org, where he works. But we cross-posted it here, so the third reposting of this. And he has an interesting perspective on this, and I think this kind of sums up what they were talking about. He says, if you assume that counting persons, individual, one by one, is the proper basis for congressional representation, it's easy to see how one could misread the reduction for slaves down from one person to 3/5 and the exclusion of non-tax-paying Indians as expressions of racism. Oh, they don't count as a person. Indians specifically, non-tax-paying Indians, they did not want them included either because they weren't contributing taxes. He says, however, many, probably most of the framers did not think that counting persons was the proper basis for representation. We think of everything in kind of a modern way. I mean, it's kind of our knee-jerk reaction. Oh, well, representation is based off of the number of people in a district, and that gives you the number of representatives in the House, and that is the basis for everything. Is kind of this I don't know, everything's a democracy. Everything is a 2-1 or a 50-49 vote. And that's not really how they were looking at it. They were really saying, you know, you may have more population here, but you don't have nearly as much money. So why would we requisition the amount of money, especially if they're requisitioning and they're asking and they're having to get contributions made by the states voluntarily. Could you imagine if you just had a really large but poor population and you were expected to pay maybe 20% more than a rich small population in a neighboring state or a neighboring colony? That just wouldn't have worked. And I think this was, I mean, if you think about it, that was really a smart logistical choice, was to address it based off of federal tax revenue. So Nadelson again, he says, how many, probably most of the framers, did not think counting persons was the proper basis for representation. They believed representation should follow, and he highlights this, ability to contribute federal tax revenue. This view was inherited from English history, he writes, and was reflected in the Revolutionary War slogan, "No taxation without representation." Again, from Rob, he points out, so I was talking about this, a committee was put together. This was in 1783, so under the Confederation Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, Congress studied the relative productivity of slaves and free workers. They really actually, you hear about congressional studies on this and that these days, and sometimes they're just garbage. I would say most of the time they're just garbage, but sometimes you actually get real research. And Congress actually put a significant amount of study into this in 1783. And Rob writes, among the factors it considered were the differing incentives of enslaved and free people, the value of their respective output, which was much less among slaves because of poor incentives. Of course, if you're really only working to save your life, for example, or to be able to be near a family member or whatever other kind of abuse it might have been, you're not really motivated to do high productivity. It's just a dumb economic system if you really want to just separate the immoral part of it. In fact, a little further up, and this was in Rob's article, I wasn't intending to mention this, he made an interesting point. He says, the recognition of this 3/5 really had nothing to do with race. It was because slaves of any race could not sell their labor and talents in a free market. They were stuck in a centralized system of command and control, rather like communism, but in a prison, like a real nasty version of it. And I think that was interesting perspective. So when they did this study in 1783, they studied the incentives, they studied the general output, the respective costs of feeding and clothing, free versus slave labor, the ages at which young free people and slaves began working, which were found to be lower for free children. So if you had a choice and you could actually improve your own life, this is shows how the market actually works. If you could actually improve your own life, people were actually, or your family, or work with your family, you voluntarily, or you got involved in the workplace earlier than if you were forced to and you never, ever, ever really got payback for your hard work. They talked about the differing climates in free and slave states, the value of imports and exports in those states, and that slaves were disproportionately confined to agriculture as opposed to manufacturing and other activities. And he points out that race was never even on the list that they studied in 1783. I have not read those documents specifically, and that's something that I will do when I do some follow-ups on this. But I'm definitely interested in seeing if I can dig through and look at those documents of that specific study. Here from Digital History at University of Houston, which we've actually used for a number of things over time, they point out that the Continental Congress debated, or the Confederation Congress, I'm not sure what the right name actually is at that point, they debated the ratio of slaves to free persons at great length. So this 3/5 debate in the Philadelphia Convention, and then the debate that happened in the ratification in the states, this was not new. Just 14 years earlier, this was a pretty big deal. So this was already in the psyche. People had often expected this to come up again. It was unsurprising that people in the South were making the case for this type of counting as well. So the Continental Congress debated the ratio of slaves to free persons at great length. Northerners favored a 4-to-3 ratio. I don't know why. While Southerners favored a 2-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio. Finally, James Madison suggested a compromise, a 5-to-3 ratio. All but 2 states, New Hampshire and Rhode Island, approved this recommendation. But, and here's an interesting part of the Articles of Confederation, they required unanimous agreement. One single state could block an amendment. So, unanimous agreement under the Articles. The proposal then was defeated. So even though it was, what was the vote, whatever, to 2, all but 2 states, when the Constitutional Convention met in 1787, it ended up adopting Madison's earlier suggestion. But we don't want to just skip right through it. And all of a sudden, all of a sudden it was just something brand new, and there was really no discussion about it. There was significant discussion about this in Philadelphia as well. And here, this is a guy named Michael Tangway, I believe. This was his master's thesis at Georgetown University a few years ago, and it's got a lot of really good history. It gave me a lot of breadcrumbs to research and learn more in other areas as well. And he says, therefore, although these percentages, and this is back to 1783 still, they were negotiated and agreed upon by the majority. Only 2 states, New Hampshire and Rhode Island, were the holdouts. The amendment was not enacted, and the 3/5 ratio was never formalized in relation to taxation, representation, or any other matter. But a seed was planted, the seed of counting slaves as 3/5 an inhabitants, regardless for what they were counted. It really started back then, and it came out of the problems of taxation and war. And I just want to point out an aside. If this was a bad part of the Constitution, we shouldn't be surprised because it came out of taxation and war. James Madison, some years later, pointed out that war is the greatest threat to public liberty because war breeds armies. From armies, you get debts and taxes. And as he put it, armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. So that's just a powerful statement, and we see how this kind of played out in history. War, armies, debts, and taxes are very problematic. Here from blackpast.org. Really interesting overview of it. I think maybe some of the details might be a little off, but this is really good info here. Blackpast.org, I will link to this as well. They say, when Constitutional Convention delegate Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and here's how the difference between Wilson and Sherman that I was talking about earlier just briefly, proposed that congressional representation be based on the total number of inhabitants of a state. Total number of inhabitants. Inhabitants. Not tax contributors, not necessarily who was going to produce the most, in no ratio whatsoever. Delegate Charles Pinckney of South Carolina agreed, saying, quote, and this is from Pinckney in the convention, blacks ought to stand on an equality with whites, but this was hypocritical. I think Pinckney had like 110 slaves himself, and you can't, man, I have a hard time understanding that thought process. But anyways, they write it this way. Pinckney's statement was disingenuous, since at the time he knew most blacks were enslaved in his state and none, slave or free, could vote or were considered equals of white South Carolinians. Other delegates, most notably Governor Morris of Pennsylvania, argued that he could not support equal representation because, quote, he could never agree to give such encouragement to the slave trade by allowing them a representation for theirs. So you had different views here. Some people in the North wanted a 1-to-1. Some people in the South were certainly on board with that. Probably some people in the South were not. And then you had people like Morris, who was a big government guy. I mean, this guy, if the big government people of the time didn't just hold their kind of minarchist version, constitutional view of big government, and then were also the big government people of today, the monster state people, Morris would not be on our side. Absolutely not. But on this, he really fought very aggressively against this. Going further, this is again from Michael Tangway, again, from Georgetown University. Put it this way, Patterson of New Jersey, who was involved in the Supremacy Clause debate, countered logically. He said that if slaves were not counted in allocating representation in Southern state legislatures, quote, why should they be counted in the general government? That's a really good point. Like, okay, you guys are having this debate, but why are we even having this debate about whether or not we should count people for representation or taxation or anything if they are owned, if they're not free? And you don't even have it in your own state legislature, your state constitution, that they can be counted for representation. So that is a really interesting kind of logical assertion from Patterson in New Jersey. He goes further. This is again from Tangway. Man, I should learn how to pronounce that. I get a lot of things. I learn how to say a lot of words from reading, so I don't necessarily hear how they get it. I learned about James Iredell at some point recently, so forgive me if I get these wrong. Michael goes on. He says, the debates raged for 15 days with the focus on representation. How to actually secure the proper representation was a huge debate at the time. Between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, from north to south, there were all kinds of weird combinations. Anyways, the focus was on representation in the houses and did little but expose sectional differences between North and South. Once it became apparent they were not close to a resolution, the convention accepted General Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, who was cousin, recommendation that the issue be sent to a committee composed of one representative from each state. So this went to a committee, not committee of 5 or something like that, but this went to a committee, and they actually came up with a proposal. That committee met for 3 days, he writes, to address the most critical issue addressed by the convention: representation in the legislature. On July 5th, 1787, the committee proposed what is now known as the Three-Fifths Compromise, which called for representation in the lower house, that's the House of Representatives, based on population, and representation in the upper house, where the states would have an equal vote. So this was kind of all tied together. This kind of federal national, this kind of states' rights versus kind of popular house. This was all kind of lumped together in that committee, and they came out with that proposal on July 5th. 3/5 for both representation and taxation was part of this proposal and started a 4-day debate over slavery and representation. I'm just giving you guys some highlights. We know, again, so Charles Cotesworth Pinckney said, let's have this committee. And then his cousin, Charles Pinckney of South Carolina, and it was, I think, 111 slaves that he had. He actually went to the convention. We know from his own statements and writing that he wanted a minimum. He definitely was on board. He's like, I'm going to fight for 3/5 or more. So again, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It's because we understand that this kind of seed was planted all the way back to 1783, and people were aware of the debates sectionally and regionally over this particular issue, how to represent. And he really wanted to get at least 3/5, probably full. He was politically savvy, though, and he wasn't the guy that came out of that committee and actually introduced it. And that's where we get James Wilson, Federalist, Northerner, not really the guy that you would expect. And I think Wilson was really more of a pragmatist on this issue, where he was like, my number one issue, and I think we'll find that out from others, is union. It wasn't really about dealing with slavery. So he actually introduced it. The motion was immediately seconded by Pinckney. And here, back to Nadelson, this is an interesting point that I want to make as an aside. He says critics contend that the 3/5 Compromise rewarded the slave states. Now, it just depends on your perspective. He says it actually punished them with reduced congressional representation. Now, if you were going to count every inhabitant as one for the vote total, or for the amount of people in the state for representation, that certainly then 3/5 of slaves then actually reduces the amount they would have had. But if you were going to count them as 0, then 3/5 gave them an inflated amount of representation. And a lot of the historians that I've seen cover this, they really only focus on the latter. They focus on the fact that if they would have had 0 representation, if they would have counted it as 0, then they would have had less influence. But the thing is, there probably would not have been a union at all. Anyways, I'll get to that in a moment. Rob says it's true that the compromise also reduced a slave state's direct taxes. But that was not particularly good deal for the slave states, because except in wartime, Congress was expected to resort only to indirect taxes, a prediction that proved true for many years. Here, back to Governor Morris, and this is from archives.org, right from the central government's website. Morris scoffed at the idea that there ever could be a direct tax. So there was some debate over this. Oh, well, this is going to be different in taxation, and they're going to end up paying more from this. But he was like, no, this is nonsense. We're not going to have a direct tax. And I forget who it was, but someone at one point basically asked, like, what is a direct tax? And no one could actually give a real detailed answer even then. And I know there's a lot of 16th Amendment debate and people that I know and love over the years that have talked about this, but they couldn't even give a straight answer. I got to figure out who that was. But Morris scoffed at the idea that there could ever be a direct tax, such as the 3/5 clause allowed, because it was, quote, idle to suppose that the general government can stretch its hand directly into the pockets of the people scattered over so vast a country. They were not expecting a direct income tax, for example, or any other kind of direct tax. Going further, this is from Paul Finkelman. Thus, the South would get extra representation in Congress for its slaves rather than zero and have to pay nothing in return. Morris said he would, quote, sooner submit himself to a tax for paying for all the slaves in the United States than saddle posterity with such a constitution. I mean, that was, maybe he meant it. I don't think that's really how it played out. Maybe that's, he was trying to draw a line in the sand. He knew that many of the Southern people were saying, well, we're not gonna ratify if we don't get at least 3/5. And so he was saying, well, I would rather pay for it myself than allow this to be enshrined in the Constitution for the United States that we're debating right now. Morris also argued, and this is going back to Michael's paper from Georgetown, that counting slaves as any percentage of a citizen, even 1/10, it doesn't matter, counting them for representation actually encouraged slave masters to import additional slaves. If there was, I mean, I'm not sure if individuals were thinking that, like, I'm going to get an extra count for the representation. I don't know how many people would actually have done that, but this, again, if you're thinking about incentives, this makes sense to me. For every 100 slaves imported, a state would gain 60 so-called citizens. I like how Michael put that in quotes. To Morris, essentially bringing the Declaration of Independence into the argument, it all came down to this. And this is how Morris put it. Governor Morris from Pennsylvania, that the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina who goes to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, I love that he put it that way, because this is a very sacred law of humanity that you don't do this to other people, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connection and damns them to the most cruel bondages, shall have more votes in a government instituted for the protection of the rights of mankind than the citizens of Pennsylvania or New Jersey, who views with a laudable horror so nefarious a practice. Now, it is wrong to assume that all the people in the North thought that just slavery was terrible, even if they didn't think the institution of slavery was necessarily a positive. Like being a pure, and if you watched my Abolitionist Society episode, I think that was last month, in the last 4 to 8 weeks, even the Northern abolitionists really weren't, they were definitely not woke like so many people are today. But Morris was really making a lot of sense here. This is an area where I think that I like a lot of the things that he had to say philosophically. So again, he argued that counting this would encourage it. Now, we know, like I was mentioning, that some in the South were saying, well, we're not going to ratify. Too bad, we're out of here. William Davey, who we've quoted many times at 10th Amendment Center, said he was sure that North Carolina would never ratify on any terms that did not rate slaves at least as 3/5 of a citizen. And if you know how the ratification debates played out, and they must have had some inkling towards this in Philadelphia, it was really precarious. In fact, as I've explained it in some episodes in the last year or so, it wasn't until Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Theophilus Parsons, and others finally came together in Massachusetts, where they were probably they did vote counts, and in January 1788 in Massachusetts, the cradle of liberty, Sons of Liberty, Boston Tea Party, they were going to reject the Constitution. They did an early vote count, and it was definitely voting no. So they came up with this deal that they were basically going to say, look, we're going to come up with some amendments, this kind of Bill of Rights thing that's going to come up at some point. And the first thing they recommended was what became the 10th Amendment. But we know that there was a heavy concern over whether or not they could get this thing ratified. So when someone like William Davey, who was very highly respected, very well known, probably pretty powerful, I think he was governor for a while as well, and he was saying, like, look, North Carolina's out. And if you're concerned about places like New York and Massachusetts and elsewhere, Virginia, of course, then that doesn't look too good. So then all of a sudden people are thinking, we're going to make some deals. So Davey explained, quote, if the eastern states meant therefore to exclude them altogether, the business was at an end. He said that specifically on the floor in Philadelphia. The business is at an end. There is no more debate. North Carolina is out, according to him. Governor Morris held on to the bitter end and made one last desperate attempt to amend the proposal by removing the ratio and basing representation on free inhabitants. So he tried. There was a proposal in Philadelphia to say, we're only going to do this based on, we're counting everybody, but it's going to be based only on free inhabitants. He went for all, he went for zero, just like Davey said, we're not on board. But the convention overwhelmingly rejected this change, with all states voting against it, including his own state of Pennsylvania, where the first abolitionist society in the country was formed in the 1780s. So there was already a strong abolitionist movement happening in his home state, but his home state voted against it. So only New Jersey supported that. And then after the compromise was passed, Michael writes, Alexander Hamilton of New York, well, everybody thinks he was anti-slavery, and I guess it was, we can grade on a curve maybe. He admitted that the Three-Fifths Proviso was necessary. And this is how Hamilton put it. Without this indulgence, it's amazing how he puts this. Such a royalist. Without this indulgence, he said, no union could possibly have been formed. So we know that some oppose on slavery grounds. There's people like George Mason, Elbridge Gerry actually weren't on board with ratifying the Constitution. Now, they may not have been super principled in equal rights, but slavery discussions were part of their opposition. Mason in Virginia and Gerry up in Massachusetts. But many saw the Union as far more important. We've already heard about how Morris and Hamilton, they were willing to make a compromise on this issue at that time because Union was number one. Now, if Union was not number one, it may have been a different story. James Madison also, for example, in Federalist 54. Here he was defending the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Three-Fifths Clause, and I think, and maybe we can discuss that at some future point, because this is a pretty long episode already, he made a pretty, in my view, unprincipled or inconsistent take on it in Federalist 54. So there was a lot of kind of just, well, this is what it is, and now we got to focus on Union. And Nadelson explains why at the end of his article. He says nearly all the framers, including slave owners, which is really just interesting, and I can't wrap my head around this. Nearly all the framers understood that slavery was evil. Now, some of them did not think that. But as Rob plans to explain in a later essay, they needed to come to terms with it if they hoped to hold the Union together. So the Union itself was the primary goal, and other things that we may think might have been more important at the time or should have been more important were not. And Rob sums up what the concern was. Failure would have led to a fractured continent and European-style internecine warfare. Basically, everyone loses in that kind of warfare. Just damaging, horrible, evil, crushing war where everyone suffers heavy pain. Oh, I didn't even pull that up on the screen. I'll link to him in the show notes so you can read that on your own time. The article is very, very interesting. All this stuff is really interesting, and I really hope you found this educational, worthy of spending some time, 40 minutes on. I really appreciate you being here. I will check in the live chat a little bit later today to see if there are Clay Kent, all right, this is great. This is worth it. He says, woke is just a puerile way of saying we're right and you are stupid. Yeah, maybe that's a good description. But the thought process on these types of things were certainly far different back then versus our moral standards on them today. Although there were a lot of people back then who had the moral standard of like, look, this is an evil institution. Now, what do we do about it? How you actually deal with it is very, very interesting. But I will look through the chat a little bit later today. I get so many great ideas and a lot of feedback and interesting questions. So please continue to leave comments, whether it's live here right now or in the archive later on. That, smashing the like button, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, that helps me spread the word so much. The reason why, especially the mainstream platforms, they're all very easily triggered. Their algorithm, that is. So let's do that. Smash the like button, subscribe, get notifications, leave comments, share links, leave reviews. That tells the platforms to show the program to more and more people, and it's been working really well. Thank you for helping out. And of course, if you want to join us by putting your financial faith behind our work, memberships start out as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I will get this show episode published in the next couple of hours, so you can find all the links and all the different platforms that we're on a little bit later today. And that's it. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope your Monday is off to a good start. I appreciate you spending some time with me today, and I'll see you on Wednesday here on the Path to Liberty.